Welcome to the wonderful world of amphibians. So this is our first of two presentations that we're going to be doing. The first part is on salamanders. So we're going to start by talking generically about amphibians, and then we're going to be discussing specifically salamanders, followed by part B, which will be toads and frogs. Amphibians are part of the kingdom Animalia, the phylum Chordata, chordates, meaning have an internal rod, subphylum Vertebrata, which means, of course, they have that rod encased in bone, class Amphibia, order Caudata, and in this case, tailed salamanders, or in the case without a tail, the Anura, which are our frogs and our toads. Amphibians are vertebrates, as we mentioned. They do have a backbone, which is encased by bone. They are also poikiliotherms, which means they cannot regulate their own body temperature. So, in a sense, they are, as we would imagine, cold-blooded. They spend some of their time, of course, in water as tadpoles in their juvenile state, and of course, their adult lives on land and in some cases on water as well. They do not have scales and their skin is extremely permeable. In fact, they do gas exchange through their skin as well as through their rudimentary lungs. They have gills for at least part of their lives, and of course some species have gills as larvae, while others continue to have their gills throughout their life. Most amphibians go through metamorphosis, the change that we know from, for example, tadpole through to adult amphibian. Amphibians are considered to have frogs, toads, salamanders, caecilians, and newts all within their family. Within the order Caudata or salamanders, there are 410 species worldwide. Majority of them are found in temperate regions of the northern hemisphere as well as tropical South and Central America. There are, however, 21 of these caudata salamanders which are native to Canada. They are mostly found in the Maritimes through to British Columbia, of course, given the temperate nature of those environments. But they also can be found in north to central Labrador and northern British Columbia as well. They can live in an incredible variety of habitats, including forest floors, swamps, ponds, and marshes. Salamanders, as would be considered normal for amphibians, spend part of their lives in water and, of course, part of their lives in a terrestrial or land-based environment. Salamander actually comes from the word, or from the Greek word, meaning fire animal, which is interesting considering some of them do bear some very ID characteristics which would lend themselves to that word. Larvae normally leave the water after about a 3 to 4 month juvenile period, and as adults they usually live on land, but of course return to the water to breed and to lay their eggs, which is consistent with amphibian physiology. Aside from their neat name, being fire animal and from the Greek, they aren't just interesting in terms of their ID features. They have some remarkable physiological abilities. For example, they can regenerate their limbs, tails, and even their retinas in certain conditions, their spinal cords and parts of their hearts and brains. So they have very pronounced ability to repair themselves after wounds. So they have very deep, in the case of a very deep tissue wound, for example, a predator has ripped off a tail, they're able to achieve almost scar-free repair of these injuries. So it's possible at any age to do that repair, not just at a juvenile era. In fact, a lot of the biological and genetic mechanisms around this repair are, of course, very interesting from a human perspective in around our interest in regenerating limbs and other organs as well. So of the salamanders in Canada, we're going to start by talking about these ones. Mud puppy, the eastern newt, the mole salamanders, of which there are two kinds, the spotted salamander and the blue spotted salamander. The lungless salamanders, including the redback salamander, the four-toed salamander, and the two-lined salamander. Notice we've provided these scientific names. As part of this course, we will not be testing you on those scientific names. The common names will suffice. However, I will stress the importance of the fact that in our industry, it is important that not only do you understand the purpose of the scientific names, but that you also can relate them back to the common name. So the scientific name is the actual standard that would be used in industry to identify these animals. So some of the mating strategies of salamanders start, of course, with breeding. So breeding occurs in the first warm rains of the spring or late summer, and these will vary depending on the temperature conditions. So a mild winter leading to an early spring can increase or sort of push forward the date for breeding. A later or colder prolonged winter will, of course, push those back. So in order to mate, the male salamanders migrate nocturnally. This is where you see a lot of movement across human habitat, roads, etc. So this is an area where we have to be careful on that. Males and females will actively search for each other, and in some cases, salamanders will only reproduce every other year based on the physiological demands of producing the amount of eggs and other pieces that go with it. Males are in fact polygamous, so they will mate with two or more females, as many as they can. Males will clasp the females with their front or hind legs, which have nuptial pads, which are designed for gripping and holding on to essentially the slimy skin of the female. Fertilization can be internal or external, so that's quite an interesting feature of these salamanders. When internal, the male deposits the jelly-like capsules of sperm inside the female, and the eggs are fertilized as they are expelled via the cavity of the female. So again, it's an interesting reproductive strategy that females can store sperm in some cases for longer periods of time. The females will lay eggs under stones, on land, or under water in moist places in sphagnum grasses or under damp rotting logs. In some species, they go to ponds or ditches or lakes, while stream or woodland species will not deposit their eggs until summer. So again, there are varying breeding strategies depending on the species, and you cannot really assign a generic rule across the salamanders. They are very unique relative to their breeding habits. The number of eggs laid in incubation period as well varying with species. So some species is much longer and some species are far shorter. There is no hard and fast rule which governs the mating or breeding strategies of salamanders. In terms of diet, they are secondary consumers, which means they are not herbivores. They don't consume directly plant material. They are generally eating insects, primarily earthworms, aquatic invertebrates, and some larger species, actual fish, or, young or small fish, frogs, other salamanders even. There is a wide variety of consumption, but if you notice, they are all consumers. They aren't herbivores in the sense that they're eating a plant-based product. They are, in fact, predatory in a lot of those cases. When we're identifying salamanders, there's really three major areas that we focus on. Of course, we're looking at the color. So I guess the redback salamander would be an example of a color ID feature that we'd want to pay particular attention to. But not just the color, but also the patterning that occurs along the salamander's back and belly. The tail, the shape of the tail, and not only the shape but the size relative to the length compared to the body. Costal grooves. If you look carefully at this image, you'll see that alongside the lateral surface of the body, you'll see these grooves that sort of are, sort of kind of embedded within the skin. The presence or absence and the number of those costal grooves are all features that we use to identify individual species of salamanders. The larvae, though, of salamanders are, of course, not at all representative of what their adult development will be. So in this case, when you're trying to identify a larval form of a salamander, you cannot use the adult features to make those comparisons. So we're not going to discuss at all the larval salamander identification features. It goes beyond the scope of this course. However, we did want to make the point that we will be focusing only on adult forms, but there are a myriad of other identification characteristics that are used when doing larval identification of salamanders. Now we're going to get into the individual species. We're going to start with the mud puppy, which has the sort of the biology that's most aquatic. This particular individual is about 20 to 48 centimeters long, so they can be longer. They're brown or grayish brown with scattered blue or black spots or blotches. They are aquatic only, and they have bushy gills, reddish gills behind their head. So as you can see here, the gills are fully exposed even within the adult. Mud puppies are Ontario's largest salamander. They are very slippy and almost impossible to hold with bare hands. They are found in water along the bottom of riversides and marshes. They're reddish brown black as we saw in the image before. They are restricted to permanent bodies of water because, of course, they have fully active gills in which that is their primary means of acquiring oxygen. So, of course, they need to be in water bodies which will have dissolved oxygen throughout all parts of the year. They will hide in various rocks and crevices during the day, and they are nocturnal, so they'll come out to feed on their prey items during the evening and the night. The breeding occurs in the fall, but the eggs are not laid until April or May of the following year. The eastern newt is our second salamander we're going to discuss. It's significantly smaller, as you can see, so 3.5 to 8.6 centimeters long at a maximum on that end. They are usually red, orange, or reddish brown, and sort of lighter brown usually on the belly. They have rough skin, relatively, with no costal grooves, and if you notice, they have these very characteristic red spots, which are outlined in sort of a black and darkened coloration. What's particularly interesting about the eastern newt is that it has actually three life stages in its life history. So it starts as an aquatic larvae, which is similar, and then turns into a terrestrial eft, and then actually is an aquatic adult. And the F stage is quite interesting because the F stage, the terrestrial stage, will last several years. It's that red-orange pattern that we saw previously, retains the black bordered red spots down the back. They can be seen on the forest floor, very seldomly entering the water. They're consuming spiders and caterpillars and flies and producing a substance which actually repels other animals. They will hibernate under logs or underwater, where they will actually remain active under the ice. So again, there's very interesting life history which we don't fully understand with this particular animal, how they transform and from newt to F. So again, we don't really understand. Some populations actually omit that whole F stage, while some populations do exhibit the traditional three stages. So it's a very interesting species that we're actively doing research on to determine more about how it lives and its life history. The spotted salamander, of course, gets its name from its characteristic identification feature, which is, not surprisingly, its spots. But there are other things here which are very important to mention. Notice it's substantially larger than the eastern newt, so it's about 10 to 25 or so centimeters. It does have very prominent costal grooves, if you can see that on the lateral sides of the animal. So again, we can see those grooves very clearly in this image. It's a very robust limbs, very stocky almost, a broad head, dark gray, but with two irregular rows of yellow spots. So very easy to determine relative to its identification. What's interesting about these animals is that the adults usually live underground throughout the summer. They are often referred to as therefore mole salamanders because that's, yeah, of course, the digging strategy that they employ. We can find them around their breeding ponds, under logs, stumps, and woodland pools, which are very shaded. So they tend to move into breeding ponds during the first warm springs in March and potentially early April, depending on the year. Males will arrive a few days before the females. As each female arrives at the pond, she's intercepted by the waiting males. She lays about 150 eggs, often in small groups of 20 or 30, attaching them to submerged twigs. So again, they're submerged in the water, where they will hatch, they will hunt small invertebrate creatures, and then of course they will leave as young salamanders when the ponds start to dry out during the summer, and then will retain or try to remain as much as they can hidden during the summer, feeding on worms, beetle larvae, and small insects until they of course complete their adult stage development. The blue-spotted salamander is, of course, characterized, not surprisingly, by its blue spots down the back of its body. So you can see here it's quite a bit smaller than the spotted salamander. It still has that darker appearance, but notice it's significantly darker in this case, characterized by, you can see, those blue spots and flecks along the lateral sides. There are still some hints of costal grooves here, not nearly as prominent, however. So again, those are some of the key ID features for this particular species. So these animals are interesting because they will inhabit temporary and permanent pools and also flooded ditches and wooded areas. Breeding will again occur in the spring, but generally in this case before the ice is even lifted. The males will arrive at the pond first. After a long courtship, the female lays about 10 to 40 eggs, again substantially smaller in number than the spotted salamander. The aquatic larvae are carnivorous, feeding on small invertebrates, tadpoles, and other even salamander larvae. They will, of course, undergo transformation in August or early September, and then will be found under logs, rocks, and around breeding pools in wetlands. Adults spend the summer underground and generally in tunnels beneath stumps and rocks, and only emerging to feed in wet weather. The, again, identification of the salamander can sometimes be confused with other salamanders which are around, but again, for the purposes of our course, we are limiting ourselves to the blue-spotted salamander, which is, again, very characterized by those blue flecking on the sides and its very dark color and some of the costal grooves. The redback salamander gets its name, of course, from its coloration. So when we see this salamander, it's relatively small again, 5.8 to 12.7 centimeters long. Notice it's very much thinner body than the other two, which we've seen, which were relatively more stocky. Relatively rounded curved tail, and the red phase is most common, where you see this orange reddish brown stripe from the back of the head all the way down the middle of the tail. So this is again characteristics that we would be paying attention to when IDing this salamander. And just to make things more interesting, one thing to know about the redback salamander is it actually comes in two color phases. So the redback phase, which we just saw a picture of, which you see down here in the bottom of the slide, has that broad red stripe, but there is also a leadback phase, which is a dark gray or lead colored back. So they are in fact the same species, just different phases of color. So again, we want to use the other ID features as well, the slender body and the other characteristics, to determine what species it is. So the redback salamanders is one of only 3 salamander species that has absolutely no lungs. So rather than other salamanders which can do ventilation through the air, through the air itself, all respiration in the redback salamander must take place through the skin, which means it's highly restricted to very moist and wet environments. So again, its life cycle is very tied to freestanding water, unlike other amphibians. So again, they complete their development on land without becoming free-swimming gill larvae. But again, that larval development occurs entirely within the egg, which is again interesting in relation to other amphibians. They are very abundant relatively. They're found throughout woodlands and wooded ravines and river valleys. You can see down here the range of this species in Ontario. They, of course, will come out during rainy periods where, of course, since they're ventilating through the air, that's where they're getting their oxygen. They're feeding on spiders and small insects. They will, of course, mark their territory. They have particular glands under their chin, which they use as scents. Their courtship occurs in September through October, and the female will retain that sperm throughout hibernation and then lay very few eggs, only 6 to 8, in the spring, which will then hatch in August and September fully formed. So in this case, remember, the development of the larvae occurs within the egg, not as a free-floating larvae that's aquatic. So this one's a very interesting one physiologically that we do want you to be aware of, and in particular its two visual phases, the leadback and the redback. This image is a very nice one as it illustrates not only the fact that there are very few eggs laid by this particular salamander species, but also the fact that the mothers, or the relative size of the eggs to the salamander itself. So if you look at the size of these eggs, all of the development, the entire juvenile stage is encaptured within this egg. So the females have to be very careful where they're putting them, and also the care that they've done around the nest and the environment that they've placed them in, because all of their reproductive success is tied into extremely few eggs, which are vulnerable, being in an egg form for a substantially long period of time compared to other amphibians. This is the four-toed salamander. This is a 5 to 10 centimeter long, relatively small, slender, reddish brown, sometimes gray brown. But again, the key ID feature, hence its name, four-toed salamander, it has 4 toes. It's got also a very kind of a strange tail, unlike where we've seen a very smooth gradual transition from body to tail in the other salamanders. If you look here, they have a very long tail, but it's actually constricted where the tail joins the body, so it actually comes in a little bit of an indent, and you can see that nicely characterized in this picture. So here are the 2 identification features to pick out when identifying this salamander. So again, one of the most unique features of the salamander is its 4 toes. All of the terrestrial salamanders have 5 toes on each hind foot, so having 4 toes is very indicative of this particular species. They will be found in moss, in bogs, under rocks, in logs, seepage areas, marshy woodlands. The males will court the females in the fall and throughout late September and October. And of course, the females will retain the male sperm over the winter, migrate towards these woodland ponds in the following April, and then lay their eggs. Each female will lay about 25 eggs, and you can see here by the range, they're occurring sort of in the Niagara Peninsula as well as in central Ontario as well. This is the four-toed salamander, so just a different picture of it. This is, of course, the female with her white belly, which it's very hard to see, her bluish black stripes, okay, with small black spots, and this is her nest of eggs that she's laid here. So again, just showing you a slightly different image of the same animal. So notice this one is more reddish than the one that we saw before, which was mostly gray. And our final salamander is the two-line salamander. This is a relatively medium-sized salamander. Notice its body is very, very sleek. It's not stocky, like for example the four-toed salamander, the spotted salamander. It's very sleek looking. It's got two lateral lines running down its back, so you can see those almost stripes that run basically from its nose all the way down its back on the two sides. It's got a very compressed tail, light sort of flecking coloring on the top as well as on the sides. This salamander is also lungless, like the four-toed and the redback salamanders, which we had at the end, so they have no lungs. They do all of their gas exchange through their skin. The two-line salamander has broad yellowish brown bands, as we mentioned. They're found along the edge of streams. They'll be found in cool streams until April, and then the female will deposit about 50 or 20 or 50 eggs under rocks and logs beside running water, and it might take several years, in fact, before the larvae will transform and move to the rocky areas at the edge of streams. We have very little information about the diet of these salamanders, but you can see by their range here they're found not in southern Ontario, but mostly in central and eastern Ontario.